It's a delight to connect, and I think we're going to have an interesting conversation today. We got a question. You want to share what the question was, or was there actually a question attached, or was it just an invitation to look at this perspective?
It was actually someone just sent it to me and said, I would be interested in getting your and Michael's take on what this man says. And then he sent me the article that we're going to go over.
Okay.
And I've read it, and I think you've read it, so.
Yes. Perfect. Well, what I decided to do with it was, I think the whole thing is a really interesting perspective on the difference between living as a human being and living out of hostility and fear, living out of the world's mind. And not very often do we run across someone, I don't think, that is going to be living out of love, at least in this culture. There are, I think, Aboriginal cultures where there's certainly. Well, it's interesting. There are a couple of Aboriginal cultures, one of them in Australia, especially, where they call themselves the real people. And they were a subject of a book by a chiropractor several years back. The name of the book was. It's a chiropractor that I knew in Kansas City, actually. She went to Australia. She did a walkabout. Anyway, she was introduced to these Aboriginals, and this group of people call themselves the real people, and they're watching the insanity going on in the world, and they actually have chosen not to reproduce, that they're going to disappear from the planet because there's so much insanity. And there's an interesting quote I want to start out with. This was a magazine article in a scientific journal. Let's see if I can find the journal reference here. Let me see if I can find the journal reference. Just give me 1 second here. I was in the middle. We just got this this morning, so the wrong button and deleted the article from my my webpage. So let me see if I go back to Jeanie's link. Here it is. Oh, pardon me. It wasn't a journal. It was the Los Angeles Times, written by a scientist man from Stanford, Robert Sapolsky. And the basic thesis of his article is there is no free will, that everybody's just pushed around by the forces of energy in the world, basically, is what he's saying. And it reminded me, and I actually went looking for this, and I could not find the source of the quote, but many years ago I had gone to a conference, I don't even remember which one it was, and someone at the conference quoted an author that said, 1 million people live and die every century and never know they've even lived. And that quote to me would apply to what this Stanford scientist is saying, and he's saying, and so I'm just going to read through the article and make some comments. If you have a comment or a thought, push 1, jump into the conversation. So, after decades of study, this scientist concludes we have no free will. After studying humans and the primates for 40 years, of course, there's one of the first errors that he makes, other primates, like we're just primates. And of course, if you think that, then this is really going to make a lot of sense. But my question there would be, really? Or primates? Okay. Stanford neurobiologist Robert Sapolsky has concluded that many factors beyond our control influence our choices and behaviors, leaving free will to be negligible in any context. And you remember that many times you we try to figure it out. And remember, in our codependence workshop, the number one pseudo solution of the non-being mind is if I could just figure this out. Excuse me, I'm making a note here. So that's why we offer that as the pseudo solution, because when you look at all the factors, and this man is speaking about and honoring those factors because they're real, if you try to figure out the factor of what happened 20 generations ago to your spouse that led that spouse to, if you could see all the dynamics down through the generations and what happened to you 4 generations ago and in utero, boom, 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 that attracted you, and, he's all these influence, you're never going to figure it out. However, you can rise above the influences and actually bring choice into the picture if you do your work, and that's the objective of this work. So he goes on to write, sort of verifying his thesis. Before epilepsy was understood to be a neurological condition, people believed it was caused by the moon or by phlegm in the brain, which is not perhaps so far away from the truth when you start looking at the plaque and the energetic blocks that happen in the brain that create things like epilepsy. So that one may have actually been kind of, a little closer to on track than most people think. They condemn seizures of evidence of witchcraft or demonic possession and killed or castrated sufferers to prevent them from passing tainted blood on to a new generation. Today, we know epilepsy is a disease. By and large, it's accepted that a person who causes a fatal traffic accident while in the grip of a seizure should not be charged with murder. Right on. That's good, says Stanford University neurobiologist Sapolsky. That's progress. And then he says, but there's a long way to go. In other words, he's envisioning a society that nobody's held accountable for their behavior, in essence, because we're all just a product of these energetic forces. And my offering would be that, we make a distinction in this work between decisions and behavior. If I say to you, don't think about the color of your car, what happens? What does the average person say? Oh, I'm thinking about the color of my car. Why are you thinking about the color of your car? Because my voice box set up a frequency, moved some air molecules, hit a drum in your ear, caused the bones in your ear to move and create an electrical frequency to cause brain cells to fire. And the firing of those brain cells, because of resonance, is going to be something to do with the color of your car. I agree with his assessment of the forces involved, that, there's no, the person who says, I'm thinking about the color of my car, isn't thinking about the color of the car. All that's happened is content in the mind is resonated about the color of one's car. That process is not thinking, it's just pure resonance. And people who live on the level of resonance, if most of them said what they thought, they'd be speechless, because that's not a thinking process. That's just information moving within the mind. So he says, after 40 years of studying humans and other primates, he's reached the conclusion that virtually all behavior, human behavior, is as far beyond our conscious control as the convulsions of a seizure, the division of cells, or the beating of our hearts. This means accepting that a man who shoots in a crowd has no more control over his fate than the victims who happen to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. It's a means of treating drunk drivers who it means that drunk drivers who barrel into pedestrians are just like other drivers who suffer a sudden heart attack or veer out of their lane. So this man's advocating for, at least at this stage in his conversation, for no personal responsibility. And if one operates, remember we've talked about carbon-based memory, that if you took your body into a lab and said, tell me what's in here, they'd tell you the base element was carbon, and that's what stores memory. And if one only operates on the level of carbon-based memory, it's true. Resonance, bang, what am I thinking about? Well, I'm not thinking, but that's what's moving. And if what's moving is hostility, rage, fear, damage somebody else, vengeance, then, there we go. One can succumb to those decisions in the mind. So properly defined, when I say don't think about the color of your car, what happens is your mind makes a decision, which is just a product of resonance, and it shoots up whatever information. If you don't have a car, the information might shoot up is, well, I don't have a car. That's just a decision in the mind. It is not a thinking process. So he says the world is really screwed up and made much, much more unfair by the fact that we reward people and punish people for things they have no control over. We have no free will. Stop attributing stuff to us that isn't there. Now, I'm in agreement with him that punishment needs to disappear from the planet. It's time for us to be done with that. All that does is perpetuate decisions based in violence. And if you look at the culture, you look at how far we are away from functioning as human beings, and that game of resonance, until people forgive this idea of punishment, self and others, then they'll do that with their language, with their thoughts, with their words, their actions. He says, we have no free will. Stop attributing stuff to us that's not there. There's and I don't know much about him, but I went and looked up the quote because I'd heard it many years ago. And the author, again, I don't know much about him, is Henry Thomas Buckle, and he says, society prepares the crime. The criminal commits it. In other words, societal forces. The games of hostility and fear set up the stage. Keep a kid in poverty, chances are he's going to try to find a way out of it. If he's not brought up as a human being connected to love, then probably the way he or she is going to try to get out of it is through some form of hostility or fear. So there are certainly powerful societal forces involved. But our offering here is that there is a spiritual faculty. We have to go beyond being animals. We have to go beyond being a piece of meat, which science is trying to convince a lot of people to stop there. You're no more than that. But when we wake up to the truth of who we are, and the beginning point, a good beginning point for that, if this is a new idea to you, is just hold a newborn baby and tap into the essence of that newborn. And what you're tapping into, and almost universally, this is a question Jeanie and I have asked of tens of thousands of people all over the globe as we've traveled and done the forgiveness work. Describe the essence of the newborn, and virtually everybody's answer is a word that represents some variation on the theme of love. And our offering is that if we identify with the societal and family forces that form what we call our personality. The Greeks acknowledge this. Persona, personality, means a mask. It's a false self that we put on over who we are. And one who lives out of that false self, Buckle's statement and the thesis of this man's article, Society Prepares the Crime, the criminal commits it, is, I would pretty much agree with it. But when we start waking up to who we are, what we find is there's another faculty, and that's a faculty called choice, with which we can go into our own minds and remove those energetic forces implanted by the culture, especially the ones that have been emotionally charged. And of course, removing those things is called forgiveness, and get to the point where we wake up to who we are. So this author, Sapolsky, received a MacArthur Genius Grant, and he says, he's pretty aware that it's a way out there position. Most neuroscientists believe humans have at least some degree of free will, the article goes on to say. So do most philosophers and the vast majority of the general population. Free will is essentially how we see ourselves, fueling the satisfaction of achievement or the shame of failing to do the right thing. Saying that people have no free will is a great way to start an argument, he says. This is partly why Sapolsky, who describes himself as majorly adverse to interpersonal conflict, I guess he would call that a result of the societal forces for himself, put off writing his new book, and the title of the book is Determined, A Science of Life Without Free Will. He's 66. They say he's got a mild demeanor and a big beard. It looks like Jerry Garcia. For more than 3 decades, he escaped the politics of academia to study baboons in rural Kenya for a few months every year. Interesting to think that, I mean, how many people have gone to study baboons in Kenya for 3 decades? Probably pretty rare. Actually, I'm thinking, Jeanie, do you remember the name of the scientist that worked with baboons? We used to talk about this a fair bit, and this, I think it might have been the same guy. I think his name was Sapolsky. But what he found was that baboon tribes, by and large, were pretty vicious, and in his writing, I remember he used to say that, he didn't like them. I mean, he worked with them for years, but he didn't like them because they were so vicious. And he observed in one particular case, there was a kind of an interesting dynamic when you look at it. There was I think it was a restaurant or a food supplier. It's been years since I've thought about this one, but this food supplier was getting rid of tuberculosis-tainted meat. And a troop of baboons descended upon, found that meat, and ate it. And this troop of baboons was one that he was acquainted with, and he was very disturbed by the fact that they'd gotten into this TB-tainted meat, and many of them died from TB. But over time, what he observed was the ones who died were the ones who were the angry bullies of the troop. That the gentler baboons in the troop weren't impacted by eating this tainted meat. To me, that's a whole statement in itself that verifies everything we've been talking about with hostility or fear is what kills us. If we live in that hostility or fear world and that hostility or fear mindset, that's literally a physiological mindset that very rapidly, when one engages in it, leads to death. And his work with this particular troop of baboons proved that out. But what he ended up sharing was that in watching this troop where all the vicious baboons were dead, the first time that he'd seen it in all the years he'd been studying baboons was that all of a sudden there was a troop of gentle, nurturing, caring baboons who took care of each other. And he observed that when one of the, a baboon from another tribe, another troop, I guess he calls them troops, showed up and was in that bully, vicious mode, the baboons in this troop would square them off, stop the behavior, and teach them, we don't do that here. And that baboon would be shifted over into a gentle, caring baboon like the rest of the troop. Just an interesting dynamic. And if I have my thoughts, probably Jeanie is already looking to see if she can find that, if it is Sapolsky.
I did find an article where he worked with them, but I'm searching the article to see if it's the one where what you talked about the baboons. But he did. There is a big write-up on him working with baboons. So I'll keep looking through the article.
Yeah, well, this one specifically involved TB-tainted meat. So I'd assume if you put his name in and TB-tainted meat, you'd find that. I'm trying to remember whether that was an article we had or was that a video? It seems to me, it came from a video on stress, I think. So think about it. Anyway, we'll find that. So the article goes on to say, a man, sitting in dry grass, faces a baboon near trees. And, pardon me, that was a note beneath a picture. The article and the picture's hidden copy, so I don't have the pictures. This goes back to 1980s. So he goes on to say, I'm really, really not trying to sound like a combative jerk in the book, he said. I deal with human complexities by going and living in a tent. So yeah, I'm not up for a lot of brawls about this. He's I guess pretty much a loner. Analyzing human behavior through the lens of any single discipline leaves room for the possibility that people choose their actions, he says. But after a long cross-discipline career, he feels it's intellectually dishonest to write anything other than what he sees as the unavoidable conclusion. Free will is a myth. And the sooner we accept that, the more just our society will be. Determined, the name of his book, is just coming out. Or this article is written about his book that was written in 2017. Actually, it looks like it became a bestseller. So the subtitle of his book, Behave, the Biology of Humans at Our Best and Worst. It breaks down the neurochemical influences that contribute to human behaviors, analyzing the milliseconds to centuries preceding and pulling of a trigger or the suggestive touch of an arm. So he's saying all behavior is just neurobiology. If it's impossible for any single neuron or any single brain to act without influence from factors beyond its control, he argues, there can be no logical room for free will. My take here, and I'm inviting conversation, if this stirs anything for you, push one and let's talk about it. But my take is that what he's talking about here is inclinations, not free will. So, no, we don't have, and over time you can develop control over your inclinations. And I think what he's saying, or what my take, my offering on the error I see him stuck in, is he thinks inclinations are behavior. And yet, do we have any control over our inclinations? Nah. Except when an inclination comes forward, then we have the ability, if we're conscious and aware of forgiveness, we have the ability to change our inclinations. We have the ability to choose our inclinations. You'll notice in the worksheet, you'll see the language that says, asking Ruka to incline you toward healing, incline you toward doing your work, basically. Because most people aren't inclined toward that. And there's where free will comes in, is that we can change the inclinations. We can change what's going on within our structures. We know we make worse decisions when hungry, stressed, or scared. We know our physical makeup is influenced by genes inherited from distant ancestors and by our mother's health during her pregnancy. Abundant evidence indicates that people who grew up in homes marked by chaos and deprivation will perceive the world differently and make different choices than people raised in safe, stable, resource-rich environments. A lot of important things are beyond our control. Now, my offering is, the key thought here was, no, we don't perceive the world differently. Our perception is different. And there's a big difference between those two statements. Because if you remember, we have a lesson from the Course in Miracles called What is the World? And the world is false perception. So most people think, when they look at the pictures painted on the inside of their eyeballs, that they're looking at the world. My offering is, when you look at the world painted on the inside of your eyeballs, you're not looking at the world. You're looking at a picture generated by your mind, put on the inside of our eyeballs. And people call that perception of the world, but really, our perception is nothing but a reflection of what's going on within. If one doesn't understand that, I can understand why he comes to these conclusions. That he thinks that his eye is actually seeing what's happening out there, as opposed to his brain's best guess at what's happening out there, perception. And we have, when we do our work, the option of stepping into directly interacting with the actual world. And we could call the result of awakening to that enlightened perception, perception that reflects accurate information about what's actually happening in the world, rather than substituting for what's happening in the world those things that the happenings in the world trigger in us and the perceptual constructs created by our minds. Is that making sense for everybody?
And it was the same gentleman that did the study on the baboons.
I thought it must have been. I haven't thought of that for, I don't know, I think the early days of the show we talked about it a few times, so it's been probably 10 years.
Yeah, I found it in 2012 and 2013. We do have a hand up.
Oh, great. Let's go for it. That's what I'm hoping for, some conversation and interaction on this idea.
Okay. I don't recognize this number, but it's area code 619. You're on the air. Who do we have?
Dr. Ryce, it's Pete Danucci calling.
Oh, well, hey there, young man. Good to hear your voice. How are you?
Good. I haven't seen you in a while. I read your book about 5 times, and our first intensive workshop.
Recently, or you're talking about years ago?
Years ago. I'm actually looking for it right now. But I think it was 97 we did the workshop.
Right.
But I find your conversation incredibly interesting, and I always offer up that what we see is the world we project. So since I've met you, I just wanted to throw something out here and get your thoughts on it. I wrote a book called The Just and Safe Culture 10 years ago, and I teach it in high reliability industries, healthcare, aviation, law enforcement. And it's really investigation when something has bad, and this happens that it's bad, but it's going to get back to the book comments that we were just talking about, the other person's book. It ends up with individual accountability and system accountability. When you look at the two, what did the person know? What procedures did they have? What environment were they in? Why did they make those choices? And the final question is, did the employee knowingly introduce unjustifiable risk into the system? It's either yes or no. And then it's either a reckless behavior is yes, and no is unsafe behavior. They just accidentally made a bad choice because of whatever. Or they actually knowingly did it, sabotage, et cetera. That's really rare. But regardless, you go into system accountability, and then we look at the system. Do we need to redesign? Do we have to change the training? Do we have to review the management structure? So we look at everything together.
Right.
So
makes sense.
I guess I kind of disagree with that. We have no free will, because at some level you do. In my opinion, that's what I'm throwing out there. Anyway, your thoughts, Doctor?
I'm with you 100%. And if you're looking, actually my book's out of print. You can catch it on eBay, or there are used copies all the time on eBay and on Amazon, or you can go to our website and you can download it free in any one of, I don't know, a dozen or so languages. But I delightedly, if you want to drop me a note, I'd delightedly send you a copy of the book and do an exchange. I'd love to see your book and see what it has to say, but I'm with you, except I would change one word in the context of your conversation with what you're saying, is that people made a poor choice. When what we would call a poor choice happens, I don't think we're making choices at all. They're decisions. They're simply, just like when I say don't think about the color of your car, resonance drives it, the circumstance drives the mind, and if one is awake in being and actually choosing, they'll always know and be inclined to do what we would call the right thing, the highest level of behavior, if choice is actually in the picture. But most people, as that opening quote that I shared, 100 million people live and die every century and never know they've lived. They've never activated choice, never awakened on that level where the spiritual being has choice. Does that make sense for you? Does that fit with what you were?
I'm taking notes. You said choice is the word I used, and you would use what word? I'm sorry.
Decision. So when I say don't think about the color of your car, I set up a frequency with my voice that resonates content in your mind that has to do with the color of your car. That's a pure resonance function.
Okay. That makes sense.
And so the human mind, if we're living in carbon-based memory, everything stored in it is from the past, and it's a decision-making machine. Everything that comes along resonates content, bang, as Sapolsky's saying. It resonates content, and bang, there's an answer. There's a decision, but that's anything but choice. And this body-mind unit left to its own resources is nothing but a decision-making machine.
Right.
When we actually awaken as human beings, that's when we can choose the inclination. That's when we can change the content of the mind. That's when we actually become fully human and begin to live as actual human beings. And then the mind serves up a decision, and I have choice. At the moment where choice can be applied is I can look at that decision as a being and go, that decision's garbage. I'm not doing that. And I can remove the root influences of it and put in a new frequency, a new energy, an actual choice. That's how I've come to understand it and would distinguish the two.
That makes sense. That takes it a little bit deeper. But I resonate with it.
And so in the situations that you're talking about with high risk and such, to me, the place to plug in would be the training to plug in awareness of who one is, and as a human being, as love, with actual choices, and then the tool of being able to remove the undue influences. That, to me, would be the key part of the training, would be to remove or forgive the undue influences from generational patterns and cultural patterns and family patterns and old, functioning out of old hurts and old wounds. And when we have the tool to clean that up, our choices become better and better and better because there's less and less influence from those wounds of the past and of the generations and of the culture or the family system.
I agree. Yeah, I'll tell you the easier audience would be the nurses versus fighter pilots.
Yes, I can hear that loud and clear.
But anyway, thank you so much. So I'm just going to keep listening here. I'll mute it out.
Delighted. Thanks for your input. I appreciate it. Good to talk to you, Peter. Good to hear your voice.
Good to talk to you. Thank you, Doctor. Bye.
All right, blessings.
I'm going to stay on here.
All right. Cool. Okay.
And we do have another hand up.
Great. Let's go for it.
This is Dan, area code 757. You're on the air.
Hey, guys.
Hey there. Welcome.
Thanks. Yeah.
How are you, sir?
Good to be here.
Good to hear you.
I'm doing well. Good to hear y'all as well. And, I have a lot of thoughts, excitement on this topic, but then I realized that it's, I don't know exactly how to put it in words, but I think it's it seems to me like the freedom, the free will is the sort of like core essence. I would link it to love, our being, and that's kind of like what's left when we cancel out the stuff that seems to be pushing us around automatically. You know what I mean?
Right.
So it's just, I don't know.
If we go back to Yeshua 2,000 years ago, where he introduces, or in the ancient scriptures where they introduce the thought, he said, take care of the heart, for out of it are the issues in life. We could reword that in the context of this conversation, say, would be learn how to open your own unconscious mind so that the inclinations and the influences there that take you into issues in your life that create dramas and traumas in your life, if you take care of what's going on inside of you, then you can eradicate the situations of drama and trauma and live a totally, completely different life. And again, that would mean that I have to call forward and strengthen the ability of choice. You know, there are 5 different spiritual faculties, and each of those faculties has a cheap copy in the carbon-based memory system, in the body-mind unit. And so the cheap copy of choice is decision. Oh, and most people call it, when they make a decision, they call it, well, that's the choice I made. Well, no, it isn't. It was just what we identify, you know, in our Laws of Living course, we identify that as the automatic decision system. Resonance kicks it in, and most people call that choice, and therefore never, ever achieve actually living from choice.
Well, it's sort of like the computer metaphor. There was something in the book that, anyway, to me it's kind of like at a certain point we committed to take various shortcuts. You know what I mean? This equals this, or this resonates that, or this means this, or the such and such, it reminds me of this, and those are all shortcuts, and we go on autopilot and forget that we even made the choice in the first place.
Exactly.
And so it's getting back to owning those choices that we did make initially, but I can make a choice that anyone who asks me a question is hostile. I can make that shortcut and with distorted data or whatever the case is, and then I'll be triggered every time somebody asks me about anything. And I'll forget that
right.
I made that choice initially, and the healing is to get back to the freedom of I did buy into this. I did make this choice at one point to this. You know, I've been in 12-step recovery for a long time, and I've sort of at times it felt to me like the whole process is coming to terms and owning up to the fact that I do have freedom of choice and not making excuses for being pushed around by this or that.
Yeah, and my take would be that the initial errant perception is probably a reflection of generational patterns. So, again, in the ancient scriptures, there's so much wisdom there. One of the things they talk about is, you know, look to the lives of the fathers, for ours are but a shadow of theirs upon the earth. Of course, it's not just fathers, but fathers and mothers, because the decisions of our generations tend to run us. You look at that whole story about the Jews being lost in the desert for 40 years. Were they really lost in a hot, sandy place, a 35-square-mile area for 40 years? Or were they talking about being lost in the unconscious mind, in the decision-making process of the cultural and generational influences? And then the alternative to that, when one, and if you look at the way one gets out of the desert in that story, in that metaphor, what does it say? It says the old generation has to die off. Not everybody in old physical bodies, but the root of the word generation is cause. The causes in the mind have to be removed. And then one gets to go to the promised land, where there's choice, where you get to choose what happens in your world, where you get to be a conscious creator. To me, that's what they're addressing in that whole, from there, that whole scriptural journey. And one of the key things that one has to do in order to be able to go inside of oneself and start to change those inclinations is to get out of their devout religious belief that somebody else is to blame for what's going on inside of them. That right. You know, one world universal religion of blame. Whenever somebody walks away from a conversation or from a conflict, and their conversation in their head or to everybody else is about how they did it to them, they're very religious, devout people committed to blame. And when one walks away from a conflicting situation or a disturbed situation and is having a conversation about themselves, they're moving toward the promised land. They're moving toward consciously being able to interact in the world and to interact with their own minds. So to me, that's the whole scriptural journey they're offering, and the wisdom that's there, if we've got the brains, the eyes to see and the ears to hear, is monumental.
So part of my belief about healing is that if I really want to be free, I have to trace back the content in my mind to all of the different times where I went on autopilot, or I made a choice to throw this switch and say, I'm not dealing with this, it's somebody else's fault, and it's going to be an automatic knee-jerk thing. I really believe that we make choices to go on autopilot, and I've got to trace back where that comes from in order to own the choice again.
Right.
And then to be free.
And when I'm tracing it back, what's really happening is I didn't make a choice to do that. That was just an emotionally impacted energetic dynamic of the generations that took away my choice, or that I surrendered my choice to, and actually just played out that decision. And most people literally substitute the constructs of their mind, perception, for the actuality of what's happening in the world at any given moment. And so tend to live out the family patterns. When one chooses to give that up and faces the decisions that they've made, cleans them out, then all of a sudden they make room for, one of the things that the forgiveness process talks about in the Course in Miracles is, to leave a clean and open space within the mind. And at that point, we get to live in contact with the actual world as it's created, rather than substituting this reality in my mind. So reality versus actuality. Reality, 6 people were at an accident and they all ended up in court, and you listen to their testimony and it's hard to tell any 2 of them were at the same accident. Each person substituted the constructs of their mind for the actual event of the accident, and therefore 6 totally different pieces of testimony. And most people are doing that 99 to 100% of the time in their lives. They never taste or touch actuality. And so when we start applying forgiveness, and when you talk about it, I'm with you 100%, you have to go back and clean those things up. And one method of doing that is to go lay on the psychiatrist coach for 25 years and look for that deep, dark, dirty, nasty thing that happened. Or you can use the tool of forgiveness, and when you apply forgiveness and collapse the construct of the mind, the decision of the moment, you get to drop. There's the benefit of the worksheets, and I appreciated you dropped me the note about you're up to 800 worksheets, and that was about 2 weeks ago now, so you're probably at 1,000, right?
It's actually 989, and I'm off work today, so I believe I'll do, the 11 to get to 1,000 today, because I have some stuff coming up anyway.
Awesome.
So yeah.
So when one cancels, when we get to that core of forgiveness, to me this is the brilliance of what Yeshua brought to the world, and the Greeks threw away. When you get to that core of collapsing the construct, the decision of the mind from this moment, and when that collapses, it drops in the mind right into the root of that construct. Now you've got access to the origins of that pattern, which might be 20 generations ago, and you don't have to figure it out. All you need to do is bring it to the presence of love, and dissolution begins to occur. Dissolution of the past, and that's what really empowers choice.
So I'm just excited about how I just feel so on board with this, and I haven't had words for it in the past. I guess I'm just getting more and more clarity through this process, because I've already had these kinds of thoughts, and this has refined it more. So it's just exciting.
Sweet.
Is it important to, and does it matter to determine if the content that I'm looking at in any particular instance is from my personal life versus generational? Does that matter to figure out or determine?
Well, remember the number one pseudo-solution, this is from our codependence work, the number one pseudo-solution of the non-being mind is if I could just figure this out.
That's
and,
what I was
if you take Sapolsky's premise, he's saying, as we've said for decades, you can't figure it out. The mind will go,
right.
I've used the example before of, I could have a workshop with 100 people in it and ask everybody their age, minus 5 years for each person, add their ages all up, and I'd have the number of years that everybody in that audience has been trying to figure it out, and nobody can figure it out. Because there are so many influences. I mean, what happened 10 generations ago to, great-great-great-great-great-great-grandma or grandpa or and now we've got this other person involved. What are the generational influences of them? What did they see on TV last night? All those influences. There's nobody that can figure it out. And the non-being mind, that's the number one thing it wants to do is figure it out. My offering is, or my take, and what I've observed over the last, especially the 40-some years I've been working with the first century Aramaic forgiveness process, is that if there's something important for you to know or understand about, did this happen when I was 2, or did it happen to my great-great-grandfather, is you'll get literally the whole story. You'll be shown perceptually, cognitively what it is. Otherwise, there's no need to have cognitive awareness of whatever's moving. The key is to process the energy. You don't have to form the trauma-based energy into a story or a picture to heal it. All you need to do is bring it forward in the presence of love. There's where the still point breathing comes in, because when you hit that still point, you've opened the resistance and stepped into a superconductor state where whatever starts to move will process in an instant, and it doesn't have to be cognitive. If there's, my experience has been, if there's a need or a reason for it to become cognitive, then it will perhaps become cognitive right there in the middle of the worksheet, or right there in the middle of the still point breathing session. Or 3 days later, you're walking down the street and all of a sudden it's like, bingo, oh, that was it. And you're shown what it is.
Yeah.
So cognition is not a requirement of the process, no.
Okay, and I think in some cases it might be like an impediment because
trying to figure it out.
Right, and so like
trying to figure it out is one of the biggest impediments to healing.
I mean, Sapolsky's view, and I like. I've actually watched some videos of his previously about just totally different topics, and anyway, I like the guy. I don't. The thing is that it's beyond what's knowable, in my opinion. In order to say that everything is determined, it's kind of like, okay, well, like you were saying, sure. I mean, I would have to know the position and the momentum of every particle in the universe in order to really see if things are being caused and determined beyond what we can really figure out. And
but it's not beyond what we can process through forgiveness. That to me is the key, whatever it is. And that's why there is no need to figure it out. But when one recognizes that the perceptual construct of the mind that's running a person at this moment is driven by a goal, and then in Aramaic the word forgive, shabag, means to cancel that goal collapses the end result of all of those influences. And then in willingness, if you go back to the definition in Aramaic of what the Greeks called the Holy Spirit, and there's nothing there about a disembodied spirit being, but it's ruka de kudsha, it defined in Aramaic is it's a feminine elemental force in us that undoes the effects of our errors and teaches us the truth. For that force to undo the effects of our errors, i.e. the 1,000 million trillion influences every particle in the universe. To do that is an impossibility for our pea brains, but for that power that resides within us, if I know it's there and I'm willing to turn this issue over to it, then that state of non-resistance, that superconductor state, allows those underlying energies literally to be processed in a second, and I'm freed of that influence.
So you go beyond, you've got to be willing to go beyond the mind. And
yes. Oh, well, you've heard me say it before. In order to heal, you've got to be out of your mind.
Right.
The brain,
so that's the problem.
The brain is the instrument, the brain is the instrument of the mind, and all it can do, unless there's an opening for it, is process or run stories and programs and energetic patterns from the past. That's all that happens in carbon-based memory. And
right.
That carbon-based memory mind, if you look at, a molecule of carbon is 6 electrons, 6 protons, 6 neutrons, 666. You go back to the ancient teachings and, there's this mind of love in us, which they called the mind of Christ, not about a man named Yeshua, but this mind of love in us that it is our birthright to use. And when we choose to bring that mind into play, we're out of our mind. What the world calls our minds, we're out of our minds. We're into another level of existence where the human being, which of course goes beyond baboons or anything else that's going on in the world, there's a whole new factor that's being introduced to the world that's beyond. So we've got the mind of love, the mind of choice in us, and then we've got carbon-based memory. Adamos, the red clay, stored past experiences, influences, play out and run the show.
Right. The computer.
Yeah, it's pure computer function. And nothing but a pure reflection of the past with all its myriad of influences.
In order to really do something like new or genuinely, freely chosen, that
you got to be out of your mind.
Right. Okay, that's
you
exactly it. You
got to make a room in your mind for that to happen. Yeah. What's his name? In Florida, the museum is there of Alexander Graham Bell, and over in the corner there's an old wire type bed frame, and what the story that's told is that Bell, when he ran out of ideas for his inventions, he had an iron ball and a metal tub, and he'd go over and lay on that bed. He'd hold the iron ball out over the edge of the bed, and he'd go to sleep. And when he would drop into such a relaxed state that the iron ball dropped into the tub and made a loud noise and woke him up, what he said was he reached into the air, and that's where he got his ideas.
Okay.
And that was his my description of that was his mechanism for getting out of his mind. I assume he didn't have forgiveness. But if I use forgiveness on a regular basis, people who have what they call a near-death experience, which is really a near-life experience, when clinical death occurs, the ego mind, the mind of the past, those influences that Sapolsky's talking about, all collapse, dead, gone. And now we get a chance to wake up to who we are. These people who come back with their near-life experience stories come back with all kinds of things that are beyond what our human mind is conceived of. Why? Because that's where we live as human beings. And as far as we can tell, there's no other creature on the planet that has choice. We do, and it comes from that level and that state of being.
Yeah. Well, this is awesome stuff.
It is. It's great, and I appreciate this article becoming available to us. And thank you, Tim, if you listen to this, for sharing with us, because it really opens the conversation on a whole other level. But to end the habit of substituting carbon-based memories, constructs, projections, to end that habit and live in a state of being takes a significant amount of work to get out of the desert, to get out of the unconscious. That word desert in the ancient scriptures is just a code word for the unconscious.
It'd be a life
challenge. It's a lifetime of work, exactly. It's like there are 1,000 voices and 1,000 unresolved traumas always clawing and climbing to get to the surface to get our attention.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And when we open the space, you go to the Course in Miracles and it describes forgiveness. There are only two places on the planet I've ever found an exact and specific definition of forgiveness. One is in the ancient Aramaic New Testament, the teachings of Yeshua on how forgiveness works. The other is in A Course in Miracles, and here's what the Course says, which kind of sums up our conversation. It says, let go all the things you think you want. That is your goals, your trifling treasures put away, it says, and leave a clean and open space within your mind for choice to come. The word the Course uses there is Christ, but leave a clean and open space within your mind for the true state of being that is you coming into this world. You go back to the creation story, and again, they talk about Moses, while Moses was a little senile, he didn't really know what he was talking about because he tells the creation story and then he tells it again. Well, if you read it, it talks about the creation of man, and it says, in the image and likeness of love, he created them, male and female, he created them, and humans are created. There's no mention of a body. There's no mention of Adam, Adamos, the red clay. And then he starts all over again. He tells the story again, and he says, there was no man. Here's Moses. There is no man to till the soil. What are they saying? There's no carbon-based memory. There's no physiological component yet. There's the human being. Evolution gives us a form. Adam, Adamos, the red clay. And then what it says, after he introduces Adam, it says, and the Creator breathed nafsha, which is the word that describes the created human being, into Adamos, and nafsha became an incarnated or a living spiritual being. And it's a spiritual faculty, this choice thing, and if you avoid the spiritual faculty, then all you've got is carbon-based memory and the influences that Sapolsky is so skillfully talking about.
Yeah.
But that moment of the creation story, he's very accurately describing the moment at which choice arrived, at which human being arrived, at which what was called the mind of Christ, which is the essence of every one of us, arrives into the world. And the journey of taking over with choice is a whole life, as you say, a lifetime of work. I'm with you too.
It's exciting, though.
It is. It's the original incredible journey, I like to say. There is a joy to it that is just amazing. Well, we're down to the last few seconds. The show's going to cut us off, so thank you for that input. Thank you as well, Peter. Delighted, and we'll